A decade of silence, a coded letter, and a deadly explosion at a forgotten creek. I went looking for the father who abandoned us, only to find a stranger's final confession about a buried fortune and the shocking secret that proved he never deserved my hate. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and desperation used to cling to the walls of our little house like a permanent resident. That was the lingering scent of my father, Arthur. He wasn't just a man, he was the architect of our quiet ruin. I remember the summer I turned 12, the summer everything dissolved. The factory shut down, the only employer in our forgotten corner of the county, and Dad just vanished. No note, no final argument, just an empty side of the closet and the sickening thud of the last rent check bouncing. My mother, bless her weary soul, tried to hold the pieces together, but a 5-person family can't survive on sheer willpower and instant noodles forever. My 2 younger siblings, 10-year-old Lily and 7-year-old Finn, asked about him less and less, but I saw the way their eyes scanned every passing car, hoping for a miracle that never arrived. For 10 years, Arthur was a ghost, a name whispered with a bitter catch in the throat. He didn't just leave us, he deserted us when the wolves were already howling at the door. Mom took on double shifts, cleaning offices downtown until her hands cracked raw. I dropped out of high school my senior year to work at the local grocery store, stocking shelves from midnight to 6 a.m. before rushing off to my evening GED classes. We were surviving, scraping by, but the wound Arthur left never fully scabbed over. It was a gaping absence that shaped every decision we made, every sacrifice we endured. We learned to build walls, to rely only on ourselves. Because when things got truly hard, the man who promised forever had chosen silence. The hardest part wasn't the poverty, it was the public shame, the pitying glances from neighbors who remembered Arthur as the charismatic dreamer who talked big about his next big venture. Those ventures always ended the same way, with mounting debt and an empty promise. So when the letter arrived 10 years later, tucked awkwardly between a final notice from the electric company and a coupon book, my first instinct was to burn it. It was postmarked from Arizona, thin, cheap paper addressed to the residents of 419 Maple Street in handwriting that was undeniably his, sharper, less fluid than I remembered, almost like he'd struggled to hold the pen. Mom refused to touch it. "Throw it away, Alex," she commanded, her voice brittle. "He has no right to contact us after all this time." But I couldn't. Curiosity, that insidious poison, won out. I waited until Mom was asleep, the house quiet save for the rhythmic, shallow breathing of my siblings in the next room. I sat at the rickety kitchen table under the weak glare of the bare bulb and unfolded the single sheet. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was brutally direct. I am dying. Not slowly, but fast. I don't ask for your understanding, only your presence. I have something to give you, something that belongs to you. I'll be at the old fishing spot by the Black Creek Bridge on Tuesday at noon. If you aren't there, I'll understand. But please come. For the kids. Tuesday. That was 3 days away. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Dying? After a decade of absolute abandonment, he expected us to drive 500 miles across the country because he was suddenly facing his mortality? The rage was immediate, hot and purifying. But beneath the rage, a tiny, treacherous ember of curiosity flickered. What could he possibly have to give us after 10 years of nothing? I looked at the letter again, noticing the tremor in the ink where he'd signed off. It felt genuine, in the terrible way a final confession does. I pushed the paper away, running a hand through my perpetually tired hair. I wouldn't go. We had rebuilt our lives without him, stone by painful stone. But then I thought of Lily, who still sometimes drew pictures of a tall man with a wide smile, a man she barely remembered, and Finn, who always looked a little lost when the subject of fathers came up, and Mom, who deserved peace, even if it came from confronting the source of her greatest pain. Against every rational instinct by Monday evening, I had called in sick to work, emptied the small savings jar Mom kept for emergencies, a mere $300, and borrowed my friend's ancient, sputtering sedan. I didn't tell Mom where I was going, only that I had to take care of something urgent. I just kissed her forehead, promised to be back before Wednesday, and headed east, the weight of 10 years of resentment pressing down on the accelerator. The drive was a blur of cheap gas station coffee and agonizing deliberation. Was this a trick? A final manipulation? When I finally reached the rural county line indicated on the letter, the sun was just beginning to crest the horizon on Tuesday morning. The Black Creek Bridge was exactly as I remembered. Rusted iron supports arching over sluggish, dark water, far from any paved road. I parked the car a quarter mile away and walked the rest of the distance, the air thick with humidity and the buzzing of insects. There was a solitary figure sitting on an overturned log near the water's edge, leaning heavily on a cane. He was thinner, his once dark hair now shockingly white, and the sharp lines of his face were carved deep with suffering. It was Arthur, yet utterly unrecognizable. He didn't look up as I approached. He just stared into the murky water. When I stopped 10 feet away, the silence stretched, broken only by the rush of my own blood in my ears. "You came," he rasped, his voice ruined, gravelly. "I came to see what kind of sick joke you were playing now," I shot back, the decade of hurt spilling out instantly. He finally lifted his gaze, and his eyes, though sunken, held a clarity I'd never seen before. "No joke, Alex, I haven't got much time left. I told you I have something for you, something for your mother and the others." He slowly pushed himself up, wincing, and pointed with a trembling hand toward the dense woods just beyond the creek bank. "It's buried there, under the big split oak. You'll need the shovel I left in the trunk of my car." My stomach lurched. His car? I hadn't seen another vehicle nearby. "What car, Dad? There's nothing here but us and the spiders." He frowned, confusion clouding his features. "No, the sedan. The blue one. I drove it here yesterday. It's parked just around the bend, hidden from the road." He waved his hand vaguely toward the path leading back to the main county road. "It's got a new license plate. Arizona plates." I felt a cold dread wash over me, chilling me to the bone despite the morning heat. I looked back toward the spot where I'd left my friend's borrowed sedan, and then I looked back at the man who claimed to be Arthur. But he was still sitting on the log, leaning on that cane, looking confusedly toward the woods, not the road. "Dad," I said slowly, my voice barely a whisper. "I drove here. I parked my car about a mile back. I haven't seen any other vehicle." Arthur stared at me, his already pale face draining of color. He glanced down at his own trembling hands, then slowly, painfully, reached into the pocket of his threadbare jacket and pulled out a key ring attached to a familiar worn leather fob, the one he used to carry for his old pickup truck, the one he sold before he left. He held the keys out to me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "Then who?" he choked out, his voice breaking completely. Who drove my car here yesterday, and why did they just call me an hour ago telling me they were going to follow through on my final arrangements? The keys felt heavy and cold in my palm, an impossible artifact from a past I thought I had sealed away. Arthur's terror was palpable. It radiated off him like heat from an open flame, instantly eclipsing my decade of resentment. This wasn't the manipulative father I remembered. This was a man facing an imminent, terrifying unknown. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice sharp with sudden panic. "You sent me the letter. You told me to meet you here today. Who called you an hour ago?" Arthur sagged back onto the log, grasping at his chest. I didn't send the letter," he wheezed, struggling for breath. "I haven't been able to hold down a pen steady for months. That was dictated. I managed to hire a nurse, a traveler named Maya, to handle the logistics of my last weeks. I told her to mail the letter from a post office far away to make sure you got it. She was supposed to arrange transport for me to the hospice facility in Phoenix tomorrow." My mind scrambled to catch up. Maya, a nurse, a second car. And this Maya, where is she now? "She drove my car here yesterday afternoon," Arthur managed, his eyes darting nervously toward the woods. "She said she needed to scout the area, make sure the burial site was accessible and safe for the transfer. She was supposed to be waiting for me down the road. I thought she was just being cautious." He coughed, a rattling, wet sound that made me instinctively step back. "She knew about the money, Alex. She must have heard me talking in my sleep." "Money? What money?" I pressed, my survival instinct screaming at me to run, but the ghost of my father was holding me rooted to the spot. Arthur looked past me, toward the direction of the county road, his face slack with dread. "The inheritance from my mother. She left it to me on the condition it was used for restitution if I ever abandoned my family. I only found out about it 6 months ago. It's locked up. A significant amount. Enough to clear every debt we ever had and set your mother up for life. It's not in a bank, it's in a safety deposit box in the town where I was staying, but Maya knew the location of the key." He took a shuddering breath. "The key to the box is the fob on that key ring. The box is what I wanted you to have. It's proof I didn't leave you with nothing." He was gesturing weakly toward the keys still clutched in my hand. I examined the worn leather fob again. It wasn't just a truck key. Beneath the grime, I could see faint embossed lettering on a small metal tag attached to the ring. Secure Trust Vault Services. "So Maya drove your car here, knowing about the key, knowing about the inheritance, and she just left you here?" I asked, the pieces clicking into a terrifying mosaic. "She said she'd be back this morning to pick me up. But if she has the key, and if she heard about the restitution clause, she wouldn't need me anymore. She could access the funds herself, and I'd be left here to die alone just as I deserve." Arthur slumped over further. "She's trying to steal everything I spent the last 10 years setting up to undo my mistake." Suddenly, a loud, sickening thud echoed from the direction of the county road, the direction where my friend's car was parked, and presumably where Maya's blue sedan was supposed to be hidden. It sounded like metal meeting heavy earth, followed by the distant crunch of tires accelerating rapidly, not slowing down. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, turning sharply. Arthur managed a desperate nod. "She's leaving. She took my car, and she's gone. She must have realized I told you where the key was. Alex, you have to get the key to your mother. Don't let her stop you. Go now." He pointed again, this time with renewed urgency, toward the woods. "But before you go, you need to get the shovel. The box isn't the only thing I left." My blood ran cold. The shovel? What else is buried under that oak tree? Arthur's eyes glazed over. He looked directly at me, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt the full, crushing weight of his paternal authority. "The shovel is for digging up what I couldn't bring myself to leave behind," he gasped, his voice fading to a dry rattle. "It's the only way to keep them safe." Before I could demand what "them" referred to, a loud, rhythmic cracking sound started up from the woods beyond the oak tree. Not the sound of a shovel hitting dirt, but something heavier, slower, and decidedly mechanical. It sounded like heavy machinery was approaching, moving deliberately through the undergrowth, heading straight for the split oak. Arthur suddenly went completely limp, his eyes fixed on the canopy above. "Alex," he breathed one last time, his hand weakly grabbing my arm. "She didn't just steal the key. She hired someone to make sure there's nothing left to find." The absolute stillness that followed Arthur's final weak grip was deafening. He was gone. Just like that, the decade of absence ended with a whimper on a humid creek bank, leaving me alone with a set of keys, a cryptic confession, and the sound of heavy equipment tearing through the quiet wilderness. The cracking in the woods intensified. It wasn't a small excavator. This was a serious commercial machine, a backhoe, or perhaps even a small bulldozer, judging by the sheer violence with which it was ripping through the ancient trees. Maya hadn't just left. She had initiated a scorched earth operation, determined to eradicate whatever Arthur had intended for us. I looked down at the keys in my hand, the leather fob warm now from my grip, confirming the existence of the inheritance. Restitution. Arthur, the ultimate debtor, trying to pay his dues from beyond the grave. The sudden realization that a substantial fortune was potentially within reach, a fortune that could finally free my mother and siblings from the cycle of scarcity, fueled a surge of adrenaline that chased away the lingering shock of his death. I jammed the key ring deep into my jeans pocket and spun around, heading toward the only other clue, the big, split oak. I didn't see a shovel, but I didn't need one if heavy machinery was already on site. I crashed through the dense brush, separating the creek bank from the deeper woods. The noise was overwhelming now, a grinding, metallic roar punctuated by the screech of splintering wood. When I broke into the clearing where the oak should have stood, my breath hitched. The oak was still there, massive and scarred, but the earth around its base was violently churned, a fresh crater dug deep into the soil, clearly unfinished. And standing beside the enormous, muddy tread of a bright yellow backhoe was a figure, Maya. She wasn't the delicate, compassionate nurse Arthur had described. She was tall, powerfully built, wearing dirt-caked work boots and thick leather gloves, her face obscured by safety goggles resting high on her forehead. She held a radio handset pressed to her ear, looking intensely at the hole, clearly directing the unseen operator of the machine. "No, I need it deeper, Dale. He said it was under the root ball, right? Move that stump. I'm not leaving until the entire area is sterilized," she barked into the radio, her voice hard and distinctly non-nursing. I stayed hidden behind a curtain of tangled vines, trying to process the transformation. She wasn't just a thief, she was organized, ruthless, and clearly anticipating a major excavation. She'd driven Arthur's car here not to care for him, but to ensure he could confirm the location before she eliminated any trace of whatever was buried. I risked a peek around the foliage. Maya walked to the edge of the excavation pit, pulling a thick, mud-splattered canvas sack, the type used for heavy construction materials, from the edge of the disturbed earth. It was heavy. She struggled slightly to drag it into the open. "Got it," she muttered triumphantly into the radio, kicking the heavy machine into neutral. Tell Dale to shut it down. I'll handle the rest of the retrieval." She turned her back to the woods, kneeling beside the sack, fumbling with a heavy-duty industrial zip tie securing the top. This was my chance. I burst from cover, fueled by the thought of my family's lost future. "Hey!" I yelled, stepping into the raw earth of the excavation site. Maya jumped violently, dropping the sack. Her goggles snapped down over her eyes, obscuring her features entirely. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy, rusted tire iron that had been lying near the backhoe's controls and lunged at me with shocking speed. I sidestepped the first wild swing, the iron whistling past my ear. I scrambled back toward the protective shadow of the oak's remaining trunk. "That money belongs to my family. It belongs to the person who has the means to claim it," she roared back, her voice distorted by aggression. "Your dying, deadbeat father was going to give it away like charity? That money was going to buy my retirement." She swung again, catching my shoulder with the dull end of the iron, sending a jolt of agonizing pain down my arm. I stumbled, nearly falling into the deep pit. As I looked down into the dark, wet earth where the sack had been resting, I realized something chillingly obvious. The hole wasn't dug to bury something Arthur had left behind. It was dug to retrieve something Maya knew about, and the sack she dropped. It wasn't empty. As I fell, my hand slapped against the canvas, and something shifted inside with a hard, dense weight that wasn't paper or coin. It felt metallic, heavy, and oddly shaped. Maya raised the tire iron for a final, crushing blow, but I didn't brace for impact. Instead, I grabbed the edge of the heavy canvas sack and, using the last of my adrenaline, yanked it toward me, tipping it over. The contents spilled out onto the muddy ground between us. They weren't stacks of cash or bearer bonds. They were 3 heavy, tarnished silver lockboxes, the kind often used for antique jewelry or rare documents, and next to them, glittering faintly in the harsh sunlight filtering through the canopy, was a small, ornate, blood-red velvet pouch. Maya froze, staring at the spill. Her entire posture shifted from aggressive threat to panicked realization. "No," she breathed, her voice cracking with genuine fear now. "That wasn't supposed to be out. That wasn't the estate." She lunged for the red velvet pouch, but I was closer. I snatched it up just as the backhoe's engine roared back to life. The operator, who I now saw through the dusty window, was a massive man, ignoring Maya and slowly swinging the massive bucket toward the pit, clearly aiming to bury the entire scene, me included. Maya screamed, realizing her hired muscle was about to eliminate the witnesses, and she dove toward the machinery controls. I felt the vibration of the engine surging beneath my feet, the shadow of the massive metal bucket falling over me, and I didn't have time to run. I ripped open the blood-red velvet pouch, intending to grab whatever was inside and dive clear, but what met my eyes was not jewelry or documents. It was a single, thick bundle of high-grade explosives, fitted with an old military-style analog timer, currently ticking down rapidly, the digital readout flashing 0008, 8 seconds. The number flashed with an unnerving, bright red finality against the backdrop of churning mud and Maya's frantic scramble toward the backhoe controls. The metallic scent of cordite, sharp and terrifying, instantly replaced the smell of diesel fumes. Arthur hadn't just hidden money. He had hidden enough high-grade military plastic explosive to level this entire wooded ravine. "Maya, stop the machine!" I yelled, shoving the still-ticking pouch deep into my jacket pocket, the hard lump pressing against my ribs. Maya, halfway into the cab of the backhoe, glanced back, her face a mask of fury and utter panic. "You idiot! That wasn't supposed to be activated. That was the fail-safe." The driver, a mountain of a man whose face was as blank as the machine's steel bucket, seemed unconcerned by the shouting. He just kept his foot on the gas, the engine screaming as the massive arm swung lower, the steel bucket descending directly toward the small cluster of silver lockboxes lying spilled in the dirt beside the oak's roots. He wasn't trying to bury me. He was trying to destroy the evidence of the inheritance and whatever else Arthur had placed there. I had maybe 5 seconds before the backhoe crushed the lockboxes, possibly triggering the attached explosives in my pocket. I spun toward the nearest viable shield, the massive exposed root structure of the split oak. I dove sideways, throwing myself behind the gnarled thickest root just as the bucket slammed down where I had been standing a moment before. The impact shook the entire ground, sending chunks of earth and splintered wood flying. The silver lockboxes were caught under the edge of the descending steel, grinding loudly, but the weight of the bucket seemed to momentarily stall against the roots. 0004. Maya finally wrestled control from the driver, or perhaps overwhelmed him, and slammed the emergency stop lever. The engine noise died instantly, plunging the clearing into a ringing, terrifying silence, broken only by the incessant, rapid tick-tick-tick of the timer against my chest. "The detonator!" Maya shrieked, pointing wildly at my jacket. "It's wired to the internal battery of those boxes. If they break, it blows." I looked down at the spilled lockboxes now partially pinned under the immobile backhoe bucket. They weren't just silver, they were sealed with heavy, tamper-proof seals that were currently bowing under the immense pressure. "Why would he leave explosives here?" I demanded, my voice strained, trying to keep my body pressed flat against the dirt, away from the crushing weight above. Maya stared at the lockboxes, her eyes wide behind the goggles. "He didn't just have an inheritance. Arthur was indebted to people far worse than me. He secured everything, the cash, the documents proving his debts, in those boxes, and rigged the whole cache with a proximity charge. If anyone, the collectors, the loan sharks, ever found the location, he intended to take them all out before they could touch his family's money." 0002. This wasn't a story of a deadbeat father trying to make amends. This was a story of a deeply compromised criminal trying to commit mass suicide by proxy to protect his wealth. There was no time to understand the complexity of Arthur's double life. I didn't know which way to move. If I stood up, Maya might tackle me to get the detonator. If I stayed put, the crushing weight might trigger the internal charge. My gaze snagged on the only potential advantage, the backhoe itself. The driver was slumped forward, stunned, and Maya was focused entirely on the lockboxes. With a burst of desperate energy, ignoring the throbbing pain in my shoulder, I pushed myself up, not toward Maya, but toward the immobilized machine. I scrambled onto the treads, using the heavy metal as a ladder, aiming for the control console. Maya saw my move too late. "No, don't touch the controls." I reached the cab just as the timer hit 0001. I didn't bother trying to disarm the charge. I just needed distance. I slammed my hand down on the function control, overriding the emergency stop, and wrenched the main arm lever violently to the right, aiming the massive dirt-caked bucket and the explosives pinned beneath it, away from the oak tree and directly toward the edge of the ravine, where the ground dropped steeply into the creek bed. The engine roared back to life, the gears grinding savagely. The massive bucket still partially pinning the lockboxes and the pouch containing the detonator against the root system, ripped free with a sickening crunch of metal against wood and dirt. The entire assembly, backhoe arm, lockboxes, and the pouch, still embedded near my jacket, swung outward like a monstrous pendulum. The timer blinked 00. There was a sound that swallowed all other noise. Not the focused crack of C4, but a deep concussive whump that felt like the earth itself had punched the air out of my lungs. A massive plume of dirt, splintered wood, and churning water erupted where the ravine dropped off into the creek. When the ringing in my ears subsided moments later, I was lying sprawled across the controls of the dead backhoe, the smell of ozone and wet earth thick in the air. I coughed, spitting mud, and slowly, painfully looked over the edge of the embankment. The backhoe arm, wrenched violently by the sudden, explosive release, had snapped clean off near the turret. The entire assembly, the heavy bucket, the 3 silver lockboxes, and the red velvet pouch containing the remainder of the explosives, was gone, swallowed by the deep, fast-moving waters of Black Creek, already being swept away downstream. I looked back toward the clearing. Maya was gone. The operator was gone. The only thing left was the massive, freshly dug crater under the split oak, and the chilling realization that whatever Arthur had hidden there, whatever restitution he had planned, was now sinking to the bottom of a muddy river, the evidence of his double life erased in a calculated, violent flash. But as I slowly pulled myself out of the cab, my shoulder screaming in protest, I noticed something Maya hadn't managed to destroy. Tucked neatly into the disturbed earth near the edge of the pit, sheltered by a thick patch of undisturbed moss that the bucket had missed, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was pristine, untouched by the blast, clearly placed there by Arthur as a final contingency. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. If the money and the evidence of his debts were gone, this journal, Arthur's final testament, must contain the truth. I flipped it open to the first page, hoping for an explanation, for forgiveness, for something meaningful. The first entry wasn't about his debts or his remorse. It was dated 2 weeks before he sent the letter and written in his clear, pre-illness script. They found me. It's over. I only have one job left. I told Maya about the money, but I lied about the explosives. They aren't a fail-safe for the loan sharks. They are for the cabin. The real secret isn't in the safe deposit box or the boxes under the oak. The real secret is in the place where I told you I'd never go back to, the place I swore I'd protect you from. Lily isn't mine, Alex. The final truth is locked in the basement of the old summer cottage, and I made sure that place burns before anyone opens that door. The words on the page seemed to vibrate, a final catastrophic revelation delivered 10 years too late. Lily isn't mine. The summer cottage, the place Arthur had always forbidden us to go near, whispering vague warnings about bad memories and ghosts. It wasn't a memory he was protecting us from. It was a biological, damning secret. The explosives had eliminated the physical proof of Arthur's criminal dealings and the cash inheritance, but he had deliberately steered me toward this journal, this final devastating truth. Maya and her hired muscle were likely already scattering, assuming the massive blast had completed the job, erasing the evidence of the stolen funds. They wouldn't know about the cottage or the journal. They only cared about the money Arthur had let slip. The immediate threat from Maya was neutralized, but the emotional fallout was a tidal wave. Lily, my sweet, quiet little sister, who had Arthur's smile but not his eyes I now realized must have belonged to someone else entirely. The desertion hadn't just been an act of cowardice, It had been an act of desperate, self-preserving flight from a life built on a lie. I stuffed the journal into my jacket, the leather cool against the spot where the detonator had rested moments before. My priorities shifted violently. The inheritance was gone, lost to the creek, but the truth, the devastating, life-altering truth, was in my hands. I stumbled back toward the creek bank where I'd left him. Arthur was still there, cold now, his body stiffening under the morning sun. I knelt beside him, not to mourn the father I thought I knew, but to thank the flawed, terrified man who, in his final, chaotic moments, had arranged for his children to find the actual closure. I searched his pockets quickly, finding a tarnished silver key, old, complex teeth that didn't match the key ring now floating downstream. This had to be for the cottage. The drive back was a nightmare of agonizing contemplation. How do you tell your mother that the man who abandoned you was a compromised debtor, and that the child she raised is not biologically his? And how do you tell Lily? I bypassed the hospital where Arthur's body would eventually be found and drove straight home, arriving late that afternoon. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, pale and drawn, having apparently convinced herself I'd been kidnapped or worse. The relief in her eyes quickly morphed into sharp inquiry when she saw my muddy, battered state. "Alex, where have you been? What happened?" I pulled Lily and Finn into the living room with me, pushing them gently onto the worn sofa, making sure they couldn't hear the ensuing conversation, though I knew the truth would eventually touch them all. "Mom," I started, my voice rough. I laid the journal and the silver key on the table between us. "Dad found me. He's dead. He died this morning by Black Creek." Mom froze, the color draining completely from her face. For a brief, terrible moment, I thought she might shatter entirely. Then the hardness that had sustained her for 10 years resurfaced. Dead? How? An accident? No, I admitted, taking a deep breath. It was complicated. He was trying to return something to us, something he stole from a very bad group of people. But he left this. I tapped the journal. "And this key. Mom, I need you to tell me about the summer cottage." She stared at the key, her breath catching, her facade finally crumbling. Tears welled, but they were tears of resignation, not surprise. "I knew he would come back for it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He swore he'd destroy it before he'd let them have it." "Mom, what is in the basement, and why isn't Lily his?" She looked at me, her eyes pleading. The cottage was my family's, a place Arthur never wanted to claim. Years before we met, I had a relationship, a terrible one. Arthur found out just before he left. He found the medical records. He realized he couldn't raise a child that wasn't his, not when he was already such a failure. He didn't leave because he didn't love us. He left because he couldn't live with the shame of raising someone else's daughter. The silence settled, heavy and suffocating. The bitterness of abandonment was replaced by a profound, aching pity. He hadn't fled hardship. He had fled a secret that threatened to destroy her reputation, sacrificing his role as a father to protect us from a truth he thought we couldn't handle. His desertion wasn't purely selfish. It was a desperate, deeply flawed attempt at paternal protection. "What is in the basement?" I repeated, gentler this time. "It's not money, Alex. It's documents. Proof of my family's, the real family's, ownership of that land. Arthur's creditors, they were looking for liquid assets. Arthur told them he sold the cottage years ago. He stayed away to keep them from finding what was really there, what he thought was valuable enough to die protecting. The deed. He knew if they found the legal ownership, they could seize everything. We waited until nightfall. Mom, her strength surprisingly renewed by the finality of the situation, insisted on coming with me. We drove the old sedan the 3 hours to the remote, overgrown property. The cottage was exactly as Arthur had described, decaying, surrounded by wilderness, a monument to secrets. The key turned stiffly in the basement door lock. We descended into the damp, earthen-smelling darkness, Mom leading the way with a trembling flashlight beam. The basement was small, dirt-floored and empty, save for a section of the far wall where the concrete foundation looked newer, patched unevenly. "He must have reinforced it," Mom murmured. "He was trying to hide this from everyone." We found a crowbar leaning against the far wall, likely left by Arthur during one of his clandestine visits. It took nearly an hour of backbreaking effort, sweat mixing with the dust of a decade, but we finally cracked the poorly sealed patch. Behind it wasn't a safe or a locked trunk. It was a hollow space containing a single, meticulously maintained wooden box, cedar-lined and beautiful. We brought it upstairs into the weak light of the porch lamp. This box was clearly Arthur's true legacy, not the stolen inheritance, but the carefully preserved history he couldn't bear to destroy. I opened the lid. Inside, nestled on dark velvet, were the original deeds to acres of land surrounding the cottage, land that was now surprisingly valuable due to pending local development deals. But beneath the deeds were photographs, dozens of them. Photos of Mom, young and vibrant, smiling with a different man, a man with kind, serious eyes, and Lily, as a newborn, cradled in that man's arms. But the final item wasn't a document or a photo. It was a handwritten letter, sealed with red wax bearing a crest I didn't recognize. I broke the seal. It was from Lily's biological father, addressed to my mother, dated just weeks before he died in a construction accident a decade ago. The letter explained everything. The man in the photos was wealthy, respected, and had left Mom everything, including a trust fund for his daughter, set up legally before his death. He trusted Mom to tell Arthur the truth when the time was right. The final sentence of the letter hit me with the force of the explosion by the creek. "I know Arthur is the only man strong enough to raise her. If he ever leaves, tell him the password to access the trust is the date he proposed to you, written backward, and that he must never speak of this to anyone, especially not my own greedy family who would try to claim her for the estate." Arthur didn't desert us during hardship. He fled an impossible, painful truth he felt he had to carry alone. He didn't leave us penniless. He left us completely untraceable to the creditors, while protecting a hidden legacy he didn't know how to access, because he didn't know the password, the date of his own proposal. I looked at the keys in my pocket, the ones that didn't match the destroyed lockboxes. They were too ornate, too old-fashioned for a simple safety deposit box. I suddenly realized they must belong to the trust company mentioned in the letter. I looked at Mom, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the sacrifice. "He didn't just leave us," I whispered, turning the key over in my palm. "He protected us from the truth until he was gone, ensuring no one could use it against us. Now we have the key, Mom. We have the truth. We have everything he was trying to save." I pulled out my phone, the signal surprisingly strong here, and punched in the number for the obscure trust service Arthur's letter mentioned. A calm, professional voice answered on the first ring. "Trust services. How may I direct your call?" "I need to access a trust account," I said, gripping the phone tight, the scent of damp earth and cedar filling my nostrils. "The beneficiary is Lily, Mom's maiden name. And the password is—" I hesitated, looking at Mom for confirmation. the memory of that long-ago summer flood, the proposal Arthur thought was his own, rushing back. I took a deep breath, ready to claim the future Arthur had died trying to secure. The date of their proposal, written backward.